Good day and welcome. Thank you for joining another consultation and discussion for the study on country safeguard systems of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji, your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 13th thematic consultation topic or theme so far, and this is the third in a series of consultations and discussions on country safeguard systems. In today's consultation, we are joined not only by Bruce Dunn, a director in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB, but also by Zara Abbas, a principal environment specialist within the same department. For this third of 5 sessions on the theme of country safeguard systems, our consultation is with the CSOs and other non-governmental stakeholders of the ADB in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. 41 out of the 59 pre-registered participants are external stakeholders of the ADB, and 34 of you are joining from within the regions I mentioned. We have 3 questions sent in advance. Except for the 6 participants, all those registered attended our previous thematic consultations. For this consultation, Zara Abbas will present the main summary issues related to the study she and her team have co-authored on country safeguard systems, and will present the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy and propose recommendation to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of the ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As you've noted when joining, you'll have seen the consent to recording of this meeting. The ADB, as a reminder, is recording this and future sessions for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It's the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address that's posted in the chat box. A reminder to please join from a quiet, distraction-free area, and please turn off your microphone when not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may be able to ask questions by either typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. Mr. Gelson Garcia will then invite you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you wish, so that you can ask your question live. To maintain a collegial atmosphere here, please be respectful to other colleagues joining the consultation. Gelson and I will co-manage the time to keep within our schedule, and should you experience any type of difficulty, we have IT support. You may ask for support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we're using today. As we're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important Zoom buttons. Aside from English, we have simultaneous interpretation today in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the globe icon. Then select your preferred language. Please then press the mute original audio button so you can clearly hear the voice of your simultaneous interpreter. For those of you listening in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, if you feel the simultaneous interpreter is struggling to keep pace with the English speaker, you can ask the English speaker to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the Reactions button. When you've clicked on the Reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can then press the Slow Down button, which is the two reverse arrows pointing to the left in white. This will let the English speaker know to slow down. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on the Zoom screen, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You will then need to go to the right-hand side of your screen and look for your own name. Click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, then click on the Rename button. Type in your name, the agency you represent, and then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in any of the languages we have available today, click on the smile icon or the Reactions button, and then click on the Raise Hand emoji. When invited to do so, please unmute yourself, and if you wish, click on the video icon as well as the microphone icon so we can hear and see you. The next slide shows how we value diverse and informed feedback. And rather than reiterating the slide, next slide please, rather than reiterating the slide, let me just remind you that, again, these sessions are being recorded and documented and will subsequently be distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and distribution of these recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen. If you have any issues or concerns regarding the confidentiality, recording, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination, contact the Secretariat through the email address that's in the chat box or that's on the slide now. For this consultation, we have about 2 hours. Here's what we have planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. Firstly, Bruce Dunn will provide some welcome and contextual remarks. Mr. Dunn, just as a reminder, is a Director of Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. From the same department, we have Ms. Zara Abbas, who will share the main issues and findings of the nature and context of the study on country safeguard systems. After the presentation by Ms. Abbas, we will have a brief 5-minute break, and when we resume, we will have a moderated discussion as facilitated by Gelson Garcia, a Senior Stakeholder Engagement Specialist on the Stakeholder Engagement team, also within the Safeguards Division. Gelson will serve as the Q&A moderator. This Q&A session will run for about 75 minutes, and you may ask your questions and share experiences in the chat box in either English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. You may also raise your hand as previously explained in Zoom. If you wish to remain anonymous, you can send your question to the 2 people in the chat box named either Jennifer DeBellin or Jude Gonzalez. You will see their names in the chat box, and you can send them a private message if you do not wish to reveal your identity. You may also wish to send us an email after this consultation. This will also protect your identity, and should you only think of the question after the consultation, this will also allow you an opportunity to ask the question. Mr. Garcia will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversation, and these will be flashed on the screen during the break. Please then also join us for a quick event evaluation before we turn you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and the next steps following the consultation. As such, and without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Director Mr. Bruce Dunn to offer his welcome and contextual remarks. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azim. Good day, welcome, And thank you for everyone that's joining this regional consultation with civil society on country safeguard systems, or CSS for short. This session is being organised as part of the review and update of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement. We're really pleased to see so many of you joining this session again. I know many of you have been in previous stakeholder consultation sessions for the update of the SPS, and I'd really like to thank you for coming back and for your continued engagement in this process. Now, to start this session, I'd like to provide just some very brief background on the process for the update of the Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short. ADB launched the process in August 2020, and this followed an evaluation on the effectiveness of the SPS by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, or IED. That evaluation made several important recommendations. These included: 1, we should update and modernize the SPS, building on the experience from past implementation, as well as considering the safeguard policy updates of other multilateral financial institutions. 2nd, they recommended developing a new approach to the strengthening and use of country safeguard systems, so clearly very relevant for today. They also recommended strengthening ADB's own implementation framework for safeguards, basically the oversight framework that we provide for our projects. And then also recommendations related to developing more clear and specific guidance, plus increased focus on building skills and capacity. ADB management endorsed all of these recommendations and then initiated the update process. At this stage, we're expecting to complete that by March 2023 by taking a final proposal to ADB's board. Now, you can find further information on the approach for the policy update, including the stakeholder engagement plan with further details on the process on ADB's website. And we'll also be providing the link to this in the chat window in the Zoom call in just a moment. Now turning to today's consultation session. As mentioned, we're going to be focusing on experiences with both the strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. Now, this is clearly a very important topic, and I know one that's going to be very important and dear to your own hearts. In fact, it was included in ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement as a key objective of the SPS. This focused on ADB helping borrowers and clients to strengthen their safeguard systems and to develop capacity to manage environmental and social risks. Of course, all of our developing member countries that we work with have their own country systems. They have their own laws and regulations, procedures, and of course they have their own capacity and track record. Now, this varies across the region, although we do see over the past decade of the SPS that there's been a lot of progress, but still there is also a lot of diversity. And while we look to have a new policy that will provide a consistent policy benchmark and promote international good practice and standards across all of the developing member countries that we work with, we also see the need to continue this focus on strengthening systems. In fact, over the past 10 years, ADB has done a lot of work in this space. We've actually allocated more than $50 million in technical assistance to support the strengthening of country systems. And this is focused on a range of areas. For example, policy and legal reform, the development of tools and guidance, and support for training and other capacity building. We've implemented this work through regional technical assistance as well as more country-specific focus, plus linkages to projects. And in addition to that $50 million, there's also been support linked to individual projects. For example, where we may have an investment project, it's typical for ADB to then piggyback some form of technical assistance. This could be upstream work to support additional experts and assessments, but also implementation support to address any risks that we may see in terms of capacity gaps. Plus, many of you that are familiar with the SPS will know that there is actually included a option, I would say an optional modality for the triggering of specific use of country safeguard systems. This is triggered where typically a country would request ADB to consider the use of country systems. And then there are methodologies and procedures to ensure that we would have equivalent systems and acceptable capacity to those of the ADB. We've not really made a lot of progress in this area, as you'll see. My colleague, Ms. Sarah Abbas, will be presenting some of the details in a few moments in a presentation. But of course, we're here today to talk about the past experience, but also listen to your views and recommendations as to how we might move forward in this area. And this was actually one of the things that the IED had recommended that we look at fairly closely. So, it's quite important that we look back on those recommendations, we look back on the past experiences, and then we look forward as to how we might continue to strengthen country systems. It's surely a long-term agenda and one that's very important as a development goal in its own right. So, I think very important for today's discussions. Now, the last thing that I'd like to just mention here is to note, as Azim has mentioned in his opening remarks, that we do value your participation. We also want to ensure that these consultation sessions are implemented in a way that's free of any risks of retaliation. For that reason, we've also been enhancing protocols. We are recording the session, but we do want to make sure that anyone that's providing information feels safe. And for that reason, we also are providing options for confidentiality. So just again to highlight that sometimes discussions around country systems can be sensitive. If you would like to raise anything but not have yourself recognized, you have the option to be able to write directly to one of our moderators who will maintain your confidentiality while sharing the question so that that can be raised or your recommendations raised in the context of this consultation. So, please feel free to be able to share your thoughts in a way that is most comfortable for you. That's very important for these sessions. With that, let me thank you again for joining today. And I will now pass over to my colleague, Ms. Sarah Abbas, who's going to have an introductory presentation on some of the experiences with CSS and also some of the further studies that we've implemented recently. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and good day, everyone. I will, as Bruce explained, I'll be giving a bit of a background of how, what our experience has been with CSS over the past couple of years. So can I have the first slide? Thank you. So I'll just share the objectives of how we did the study and how the existing SPS covers strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. And then we also conducted a comparative analysis, and we'll be sharing the findings of that based on our experiences, but both things. Can I have the next slide, please? So the objective of the study was to learn from our experience with ADB's current SPS and how it addresses strengthening of country systems and also the use of country systems. There are two distinct areas. And then we would propose some next steps for further consideration. And this would be based not only on our experience, but also that of the findings of what other MFIs, our comparator MFIs, are doing in this area, and who also have similar provisions in their safeguards frameworks. Next slide, please. So before we start discussing the findings of the study, it's important to explain how ADB's safeguards policy looks at country safeguard systems, or CSS. So right at the very objective level of the policy, the SPS emphasizes strengthening of client safeguard systems and client or borrower capacity to manage environmental and social risks. Then In addition to that, there's also the provision that country safeguard systems may be used for ADB finance projects. And these can be used either at the country level, the level of the sector, say if it's a transport, energy, or any other sector, or at the level of an agency which will be implementing a project. And this can be done for either one of the safeguards or for all of the safeguards, like either environment, involuntary resettlement, or indigenous peoples, all of them, or a combination of those. So in order to assess the use of country systems, the policy, our present policy, the SPS, requires 2 steps to be undertaken. So there's a review of firstly the equivalence of the system, that is, which looks at whether the CSS, the country systems, are they designed to meet the same objectives of the SPS? And beyond the objectives, do these systems adhere to the policies, the scope and triggers and application across the principles of this SPS? And after that, another assessment of the system's implementation track record also is required. So it's a 2-staged process. And one thing, and in addition to this, which I want to clarify, is that projects that do follow CSS after they're approved and after they're found feasible, they are just like any other ADB project, and they are ADB's accountability mechanisms role, and ADB supervisory role remains unchanged. So that's how I felt it's important to define and explain how that system would be. Next slide, please. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that we looked at what our other comparator MFIs are doing. So I didn't go into the details of which ones we studied. So as part of our overall policy update, we are benchmarking against the policies of other MFIs. So when we looked at those, we see that from the ones that are that we have been looking at, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Inter-American Bank, and the World Bank have in their safeguards frameworks have similar provisions that they do allow for the use of country safeguard systems for their projects. So what we see is that what we want to see is that what are the key features of their methodology in comparison to our present methodology. And as Bruce explained, part of the work that we're doing based on the IED evaluation is to also review our approach to how to use country safeguard systems. So what we saw was that both AIIB and IDB undertake reviews of their client or borrower's safeguard systems. And if these are found to be materially or functionally consistent, so these are terminologies that they use, materially functional, consistent or functionally consistent with the objectives of the policy framework, and if the system is adequate to address the risks and impacts of the project for which it is proposed to be used, then it's allowed. So and the World Bank also, so we saw that the World Bank also supports the use of borrower systems if it addresses the risks and impacts and achieves the objectives materially consistent with the World Bank's environment and social standards. So and then also in all 3 cases, if there are gaps, they're filled through a time-bound action plan, and then that becomes part of the legal agreements for that particular investment. So in addition to these observations, we saw that with regards to the World Bank's approach, they had also recently supported the application of their standard, the country systems in lieu of their ESF for at the level of a standard. So that was done for the labor standard, where there was they saw that national labor laws were being successfully implemented based on the reports from other international organizations, relevant labor organizations. And also, since we're looking at their approach of other MFIs, we also saw that the World Bank also looks at project level use of country systems or borrower systems, and then assesses whether the project will be again materially, whether it would meet the objectives which are materially consistent with the ESSs. So in addition to this assessment, to these approaches, the World Bank has an overall assessment that they call the overview assessment, which is undertaken to assess the capacity and the borrower's capacity and implementation capacity. And the objective of that is to identify within the borrower's framework where are there opportunities for strengthening and avenues for capacity building support. So these assessments in the case of the World Bank can also be used to assess material consistency, but their objective is to assess what the system, what are the strengths of the system or weaknesses where and opportunities for strengthening. Next slide, please. I will not go into this in too much detail, but as Bruce already explained, that the evaluation of the SPS that was conducted by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department made a recommendation that a more pragmatic approach was needed in the new policy to for the use of CSS. And not only should it be pragmatic in how it's accomplished, but also it needs to be more of a sustained approach towards legislative and policy capacity development, and through broader set of financing modalities. So an overall approach which looks at the bigger picture was is what we're trying to see how we can. That's why we studied other systems as well. And next slide, please. So in Bruce's opening remarks, he mentioned that how ADB has been working with the developing member countries on building capacity for CSS. So this would be as required under ADB's, the overall SPS's objectives. So as we can see, the slide has these details, but ADB over the past 10 years or more and more now, since the SPS came about in 2009, we've worked with more than 40 DMCs and had initiated more than $50 million worth of technical assistance programs, which looked at different aspects of strengthening of country systems, not directly for at the legal level, but there were different types of assessments, different types of interventions, such as preparing guidelines, trainings, reviews of different sector plans for safeguards. And also there was, as part of, excuse me, a previous TA or technical assistance, overview assessments or reconnaissance level assessments of equivalence were undertaken for 40 DMCs for various safeguards, and these were also were used to gain an idea of the level of equivalence. Then there was, in addition to this, more significant support was given in 3 DMCs, Indonesia, India, and Sri Lanka, for again studying the systems. Another activity that in 2016, a coordinating group was established, which is known as the Joint Regional Community of Practice on Safeguards, and this group is comprises of ADB, the AIIB, Australia's Development of Foreign Affairs, Department of Foreign Affairs, and JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, and the World Bank. So this group, the COP on safeguards, has been working to bring the country systems of the region, Southeast Asia, and introducing good practice, and also share diagnostic work in this area, and the overall so that the overall systems are enhanced. So this group has worked and has been looking at focusing on local institutions and strengthening of national safeguards implementation capacity. And this was done by establishing safeguards learning centers. And there are 3, there's one in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and Indonesia. And so this is a very important area that was looked at. So, so the idea is that how do we build on this? Can I have the next slide, please? So after looking at the strengthening component, I'm going to go into more detail on the use of country systems. So in 2017, ADB reviewed the corporate safeguards framework of Power Grid Corporation of India and approved the use of agency level CSS for Power Grid of India for ADB projects. So the Power Grid is not only does it have its own safeguards framework, but it also has the authority to amend it. And so the safeguards assessment was undertaken, it identified gaps, and a gap filling action plan was prepared, which became part of the project's legal agreement. So this, you can see, was a project level and an agency level approval of CSS. So based on this, after Power Grid's experience, in the period between 2017 to 2019, 3 other DMCs, Indonesia, India overall at the national level, and Sri Lanka, requested ADB to assess the feasibility of using CSS. In 2017, the use of agency-level CSS for environment and involuntary resettlement safeguards was explored for Indonesia's state-owned electricity company, PLN. Now, the slight difference was that unlike Power Grid, which had its own safeguards framework that it followed, PLN follows the National Safeguards Framework for implementing its projects, although it is a state-owned company. So to assess equivalence, each ADB safeguards policy principle for environment and involuntary resettlement, along with its several components, were compared against the relevant national laws and regulations for environment and IR. And wherever gaps were found, gap filling measures were identified and discussed with PLN. And then for acceptability, the implementation practices were reviewed in detail. So this entire process took a long time for many reasons. The main reason was availability and accessibility of the detailed laws and regulations and their legal translations into English, discussions with other line agencies which were involved in implementing these safeguards in the field level, and also discussion with other MFIs that have been involved in capacity building in Indonesia, and specifically with PLN. That would be the World Bank, who has, together with ADB, established the Learning Center in Indonesia to build the capacity of implementing agencies in Indonesia. So the PLN Board of Directors also since it's a state-owned company, but it has the authority to issue decrees that are legally binding for PLN staff and its contractors that are working in the field. So this feature of PLN made it possible to fill the equivalence gaps after gap filling measures were identified and agreed with PLN. The gap filling action plan was agreed upon between PLN and ADB, and PLN adopted a decree to implement the gap filling action plan. However, at that time, there was some changes in the legal framework in Indonesia, and then also there were some delays due to COVID-19. And as a result, the proposal for CSS for PLN could not be submitted to the board due to these last-minute changes and the delays. The entire analytical work was completed. So, so coming to India now, the concurrent to the request by Power Grid, the government of India also requested an overall national safeguards review for all three SPS safeguards areas, as well as sector level summary equivalence should also be conducted for the energy and transport sectors. So this was done, and draft equivalence assessment reports were prepared and shared with the government of India for feedback. So once we receive this feedback and it's completed, it will be possible for ADB to finalize the assessments, the equivalence assessments and acceptability, and discuss it, equivalence assessments, and then discuss it, discuss the next steps with the government. In parallel to the work that was happening in Indonesia in 2017, the government of Sri Lanka also requested a safeguards review for agency levels use of CSS by their roads department, the Roads Development Authority, RDA. And so RDA is also a state-owned enterprise, but a key difference, unlike PLN, and in contrast to both PLN and Power Grid, PLN does not have, RDA does not have the authority to issue any binding directives or decrees which can fill eventually any gaps that are found. So assessments were undertaken and gaps were identified and within the environmental and involuntary safeguards, IR safeguards. But again, since these could not be filled legally, as it was done for Power Grid, but ADB and RDA had discussions, and going forward, RDA was of the view that ADB support would be better used if we could focus on acceptability, and that was done by working on strengthening their safeguards, existing safeguards manuals in certain areas that they had identified. So we then used those assessments and that their commitment to strengthen their systems. Next slide, please. So based on this experience and these three cases that I've explained, we analyzed these, and we also looked at the other findings, and we identified some key challenges. And well, the very first is the challenge of establishing equivalence. The safeguards policy principles are comprehensive, complex, and there are a range of requirements embedded within each policy principle. And a single safeguards policy principle may encompass many aspects and requirements, which when compared with national legal frameworks can be spread across many laws and regulations and across several regulatory bodies as well. So making the analysis to establish equivalence is a very, very complex and lengthy and legal process. Another challenge observed with establishing equivalence is that equivalence is an ongoing process, as laws and regulations can change quite frequently. And each change requires for revisiting or revising the assessments of equivalence, either completely or partially, or and then also revision. This means that disclosure and public consultations need to be done again, or need to be repeated. In another difficulty was in obtaining accurate translations, which were legally sufficient and to compare with SPS. So equivalence gaps can be filled where the agency has authority to make corporate rules to fill the gaps, and so that the system becomes more, it can be compared to international best practice, and where it's possible to agree with the agency on the gap filling action plan. So in cases where the agency does not have such an authority, it cannot be implemented. The gap filling action plans cannot be implemented. And then lastly, we find that acceptability assessments, it was quite difficult to obtain the implementation data or implementation information, and due to the difference in monitoring requirements or access. So we felt that field level audits would have been needed, but that was also very time consuming, which we saw that was, and another challenge linked to changes in legal framework means that when a legal framework changes, then the acceptability gap also, a new acceptability gap is created because there's then no implementation experience of that changed legal requirement. So next slide, please. So just summarizing, yes, it's possible to use CSS only if the at the agency level, if the agency has a robust system and legal authority to change that system or make amendments within that system. So based on this, we had 5 key lessons learned, and just discuss the first 3 here, then the next are on the next slide. So the first is to pursue early and strategic engagement with our developing member countries. Now, this can be done through ADB's country programming strategy, and when the regional departments have a planning exercise with the governments, and that country level engagement is when we can start a strategic dialogue on key sectors or areas where it's usefully engage with them and identify what are the priority areas, what are the priority sectors, and within these, what are the areas where CSS strengthening of country systems relating to safeguards can take place. So, and if so, at this stage, then if an assessment or of their capacities is undertaken, that can also serve to establish as a baseline and give us indicators and give also the DMC's indicators to monitor in the future. And second is, in addition to continuing ongoing capacity building initiatives such as safeguards learning centers that were established together with other development partners in the region. Of course, this can be continued and can be replicated across other sub-regions within ADB. There is also a need to develop new approaches to build project level safeguards capacity at the DMC level, and based again on, say, the previous step where we have identified priority sectors and key areas where these interventions can take place. Now, in order to mainstream safeguards good practice into a country's safeguard systems, institutional and legal reforms are definitely needed. And these legal reforms can only be undertaken over a long-term engagement, and where dialogue is sustained over a year, many years, starting through the country programming stage and also from the government's interest in certain sectors. So I'll continue with these on the next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? So the key is progressive strengthening of CSS. Now, progressive strengthening, as I mentioned earlier, by a strategic dialogue linked to the country programming strategies and the plans, and then how to link that with safeguards outcomes with financing modalities. So as I mentioned, long-term engagement to achieve legal reforms can be a good way to go. So ADB has a lending window called the policy-based lending. So this can provide an opportunity to converge national safeguard systems towards good practices. And then this is again linked to early dialogue, early engagement with the DMC, identifying priority areas, identifying priority sectors where there could be a possibility of improving or rather enhancing the national systems through policy-based lending, identifying areas where policy changes could be made through this lending window. Now, another financing modality, which is already being used at ADB and is the results-based lending. Now, the results-based lending applies the country systems at the level of a program. So this is at the level of a program within an agency. And but in that case, the ADB's safeguards become the compliance benchmark, and a program action plan is prepared to fill the gaps between ADB's safeguard systems and the program, and whichever safeguard systems the program would follow. If it's with the CSS, so what are the gaps there? So in a way, a small assessment takes place at that stage. So RBLs can be a means to progressively build safeguards capacity. Now that would start with at the level of that particular program, then at the level of that institution, and improving practice and introducing and enhancing systems as we go along and within that program. So again, that is a way of progressively, slowly strengthening CSS within an institution. So as mentioned in an earlier slide, the World Bank has just recently looked at applying CSS at the level of standards. That could be looked at, but we have very limited data there at the moment. And then also looking at project level CSS. That is similar to that is also a World Bank experience, but that is also similar somewhat to looking at an agency. In each of these cases, though, gap filling actions and capacity needs both can be linked to the project through legal agreements. So filling actually gaps in the provisions as well as capacity gaps. Okay, so I think that's where I will leave you all with these thoughts and just reflect on the difference between strengthening country systems, using, and then a combination of how strengthening can be achieved in overall sustainability of that. So I'll hand it over to Azim, who will give you some questions to further think on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Zara, for the wonderfully comprehensive presentation and for also providing us with the clarity and feedback and some of the comparative IFI processes related to the country safeguard systems. And in particular, the objective of how the ADB can help borrowers and clients strengthen their safeguard systems and develop the capacities necessary to manage various country-specific risks, as well as the acceptability and equivalency principles which you spoke about. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing the discussion. And we hope from both of these presentations, we can now solicit further feedback from you on what the ADB should consider in these general policy topics and areas during the facilitated Q&A session. This session, as a reminder, will run for about 75 minutes, but there is some flexibility in that. But before we jump to the session on the Q&A, let's pause for a brief 5-minute break to absorb everything that's been delivered. Before we do, I actually want to offer a reminder and an invitation for you to all think about a poll question that we will have a little bit later on. The poll link is being flashed in the chat box now, and it's on menti.com. Please think about during the break how we can specifically improve, augment, and encourage improved participation, dialogue, and discourse on these consultations. And if you have some specific ideas, please feel free to share 4, 5, or 6 sentences on how specifically these engagements can be improved. Share your thoughts on the menti.com link that is being posted in the chat box. This link will remain open for a few hours after this consultation. So even if you don't have your ideas fully formulated now, you will have an opportunity to contribute to how we can improve the consultations for at least the next few hours. When we return, we will be joined by Gelson Garcia, a senior stakeholder engagement specialist on the SCP team, who will frame the discussion and set the remit for the Q&A session on the country safeguard system. If you have a look at the next slide, you will see a countdown timer in the top right-hand corner. When that timer reaches 0, you'll know it's time to return to your screen. When the music begins to fade away, you'll also know that it's time to return to your screens. And in the meantime, we've got the 3 guide questions up that Gelson will use as an approach for framing the discussion. So with that, have a nice break, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Thanks very much and welcome back. We will now have the country safeguard systems study discussions as facilitated by Mr. Gelson Garcia, as I mentioned, with Ms. Zara Abbas's and Mr. Bruce Dunn's context in mind. Let's now hand it over to Gelson, who will take questions in this order. First, some of the advanced questions, and secondly, questions asked live through the raising of the hand function using the reaction button on the Zoom screen, and thirdly, through questions posted in the chat box. Gelson will prompt us with the guide questions to frame the conversation, and a reminder that you can ask questions in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese, both orally as well as in the chat box. And to protect your anonymity, if you don't wish to reveal your identity, you may also post, as Bruce and I mentioned, your question anonymously by sending your question to Jennifer DeBellin or Jude Gonzalez, whose names appear in the chat box. And a reminder that you will please stay with us to join us for a quick event evaluation after the Q&A session before we turn you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. So with that, let's start without any further delay. Over to you, Mr. Gelson Garcia.
Thank you, Jim. Can you confirm if you hear me well?
I can hear you very well, Gelson.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I see some hands raised already and some questions in chat box. So I will call you accordingly. But first, let me start with some basics. This session is when ADB is now in a listening mode, when it's time for your voices to get heard. As mentioned, we have approximately 75 minutes for listening and circling back to comments. Some of you may still be formulating your questions or comments, so let me highlight 3 important points to guide our discussion. As the primary target audiences of this session, we'd like to hear your views and recommendations, including you civil society organizations and independent consultants who are engaged in development projects, either as external monitors or internal independent monitors or technical service providers that pertain to safeguards implementation. Our registration shows we have 13 countries from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific that are represented by 34 participants. Second, as the topic deals with the strengthening of and the approach to using CSS, let me again go back to the basic, because this was raised in a question in chat box. I think it would be good to again reiterate what is country safeguard system. In the context of the safeguards policy statement, the 2009 safeguard policy, CSS, is defined as a country's legal and institutional framework consisting of its national, subnational, or in a number of cases, we call it regional, provincial, municipal, barangay in the Philippines. In some other places, it's kecamatan or districts, or sectoral implementing institutions and relevant laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that pertain to the policy areas of environmental and social safeguards. So that's a lot in different countries. No? So it's time to hear from you about the challenges and results of applying ADB safeguards requirement as they apply to your countries. We know that there are different regulatory frameworks in each country, and over the years, some have undergone reforms while others remain the same. But there's also a recognition that some have relevant, if not potentially equivalent or acceptable laws, regulations, and agency mechanisms. But what has been your experience so far, and what works and what needs caution in applying CSS? That's why we sent you in advance 3 questions last week as part of the consultation materials that were sent, including the PowerPoint. So again, let me just reiterate the three questions. I think they have been flashed on screen. It will be worth flashing them again. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the SPS approach to CSS? And why are your recommendations? What are your recommendations for the new policy? How could ADB better work with its clients in affected communities and CSOs to strengthen CSS and the capacity to use it? Are there good practices outside of MFIs that ADB should be looking at with respect to country safeguard system? So in addition to Director Bruce Dunn and Zara Abbas, we are also joined by other experts and practitioners in the field to respond to your questions. We have Mr. Ricky Barba, the Principal Safeguard Specialist who leads ADB Safeguards implementation for the South Asia Department. And Ms. Irina Novikova, Principal Social Development Specialist, is also in our panel. So you now know the mechanics because many of you have been to our previous consultations. If you wish to make intervention, raise your hand or write your comments in chat box and we will call you accordingly. And if you feel more comfortable speaking in your language of choice, we have Bahasa Indonesia, Chinese, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese interpreters to assist you. And again, if you wish not to be identified and not to be named, you can let us know so we can read your questions anonymously. Now you can send it to me or Jennifer and my colleague Josh. All right, so let's get the ball rolling. I see a hand raised already by Mr. Yubel, but let me start first with some people that really are relatively new here, but they are now currently in the room. So this is the order of people I would be calling accordingly. I'll start with Ria Kuis-Praptini, who is the chairman of the Asosiasi Lingkuran Industri Pinanggalistikan Nasional Indonesia. After him, and after a question, then I will call on Ms. Claire Forbes, who is the senior SNL specialist from Cardno, based in Australia. Then we also have Dr. Guoqing Shi, the director of Nanjing Huaki Engineering and Consulting Firm. And then I'll get to you, Yubel, if that's all right. So that's the first batch of our questions. So may I now call on Ms. Kuis-Praptini Ria from Indonesia, please. Mr. Ria? Okay, maybe I can get back to you later if your connection is stable. So maybe on that note, I will go to Miss.
Hello.
Okay, you're here. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, my internet is unstable.
That's fine. Please go ahead. It's good that we have to call you first before we lose you.
Yes, okay. I just want to make sure, can this safeguard system be flexible to be adapted to the condition of the place or country that will be applied? Because in my experience, there are sometimes there are gap there and make some difficulties to when we apply the system. So I think safeguard policy will be flexible, have the flexibility for that, because even the same country, negara berkembang. Okay, I speak in Indonesia, please. Walaupun sesama negara berkembang, tetapi kondisi negara dan peraturannya berbeda-beda, sehingga apabila tidak ada fleksibilitas dari safeguard ini, maka itu akan menyulitkan pada saat aplikasinya di lapangan. Itu yang sering saya temui pada saat safeguard ini diaplikasikan di tempat kami. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Ibu Ria. I think this is a very good start for the discussion. And may I call on Ms. Zera Abbas first to respond, given that in addition to other projects that ADB has been supporting in Indonesia, it's also in Indonesia where there was a diagnostic work with the PLN on the use of CSS. So why don't we start with you, Zera, and I could call Bruce later to add more comments.
Okay, thanks, Nelson. I will try, but I think after me, I will probably hand over to Irina because I think I sort of understand where the question is coming from. So the objective of under the present policy, now the present policy is has these it's structured in such a way that the equivalence which needs to be established has to be established according to it goes beyond the policy objectives and goes into the details of the policy principles. And that leaves very little room for flexibility because at every level it has to be looked at very carefully. So that I think is with regards to and this is why I think there was this the IED evaluation highlighted that we need to see how to make it more pragmatic and also build capacity at the same time. That that is the review process that's going on, and I think your comment is very good to see how we can adjust with and look at national laws, but then not lose sight of the good practice, because the objective is to strengthen the systems to incorporate good practices there. So I think if after this, if Irina wants to add to this, or Bruce, either, because of the context.
All right, so Bruce, do come in. Thanks,
Yeah,
Irina.
Bruce.
Thank you very much, Jelson. Thank you, Ibu Ria, for joining today. It's very much appreciated, and thank you for your good first question. I just would actually like to clarify a little bit before I do come in and respond, that I understand your question carefully. One, just want to check whether you're talking about the ADB procedures in terms of formal use of the country's safeguard systems and how we assess those, or if you're more talking about, the implementation level and adaptation at the implementation level. Just to be clear, so I can respond in the right way. Thank you.
Ibu Ria, would you like to come in to clarify exactly about the flexibility or adjustment that you're pointing out? Is it more on the policy level or
Saya
implementation procedure?
Jadi di implementasinya yang banyak, ya, makanya kami memerlukan mungkin fleksibilitas dari kebijakannya, karena terus terang kalau di Indonesia ini penerapan dari satu pulau ke pulau yang lain pun akan berbeda, perlukan ada perbedaan di sana. Jadi kalau persis harus seperti theoretically itu selalu harus ada penyesuaian, karena nanti akibatnya adalah jadi stuck di sana, dia tidak berjalan, program itu tidak berjalan, bukan karena tidak dapat dilaksanakan, tetapi karena kondisinya yang tidak memungkinkan untuk dilaksanakan. Ini sayang sekali sebetulnya. Jadi safeguard ini bagus untuk menjaga, menjamin keamanan masyarakat segala macam itu, tetapi pelaksanaannya pun sepertinya harus harus mempertimbangkan kondisi real di lapangan tempat tersebut itu yang karena terakhir saya pernah dengar bahwa ada kata-kata bahwa ini adalah kebijakan untuk negara berkembang. Oke. Tapi negara berkembang pun itu bermacam-macam kriterianya, spesifikasinya, kemudian kondisinya, keadaannya pun berbeda-beda. Indonesia dengan Vietnam, dengan Indonesia dengan Myanmar, atau Indonesia dengan negara berkembang lainnya, itu berbeda kondisinya. Gitu ya. Jadi seperti diketahui di kita itu ada berapa banyak suku masyarakat adat yang berbeda-beda juga. Jadi itu yang saya maksudkan adalah di situ. Supaya safeguard ini tetap bisa berjalan sesuai dengan kondisi, standar-standarnya tetap terpenuhi, tetapi ada fleksibilitas untuk penyesuaian dengan kondisi lapangan. Jadi ada beberapa dari teman-teman ADB Indonesia yang waktu itu juga sering saya sampaikan keluhan saya, ini seperti ini sulit untuk dilaksanakan. Jadi mungkin itu perlu pertimbangan. Di sini kita kan sedang mengadakan perbaikan ya. Jadi mungkin itu bisa menjadi salah satu tambahan pertimbangan. Terima kasih Pak Jelson.
Terima kasih, Ibu Ria. I think your elaboration is crystal clear. You're pointing to the flexibility in the implementation, recognizing the different local conditions of the project. So let's go back to you, Bruce, and if Irina would like to come in, please do. Thanks.
Right. Thank you again, Ibu Ria. That's very helpful and clear. So let me mention a number of points here. Firstly, in the usual application of ADB's policy to a project. So ADB's safeguard policy statement sets out our policy objectives, the scope of the policy, the principles, and then it has specific requirements. And that needs to be applied to different projects and in that specific project context. So we would do screening, we would understand what the project is about, what it's proposing to do in that particular situation, what the potential impacts and risks are. And as part of the assessment process for a regular project, we would also look at the country legal framework, what are required by the country, but also we'd look at the local context. For example, there might be local regulations in the area that the project is going to be implemented. And of course, there are local situations you mentioned around ethnicity or indigenous people. So those issues need to be assessed also at the local level. So that's a usual process that is done. And of course, the more that you can understand about the local context and the experience and the track record of the implementing agency at that local level, the better. That's really important to have that. And in fact, for our new policy, we would like to strengthen what we're calling contextual analysis or understanding the contextual risks. So really, what is that local situation and how do we apply? So that's the typical project scenario. So that was the first thing that I wanted to mention. But in this consultation, we've also been talking through Ms. Sarah's presentation about the potential to use or adopt the country systems for a project. And that is something that is allowable under ADB's safeguard policy statement, but under fairly stringent conditions. We need to be able to show that it is equivalent to ADB's policy objectives, scope, and policy principles, and also that there is acceptable implementation capacity. So we do assessments on that. Now that is typically done at either the country level or for a sector or for a particular agency. And that lets us understand more at the broader systems level what are the laws and regulations and capacity that would apply. However, if that was then going to be applied using the country systems to a particular project, we would still then, in the next stage, have to do further project level assessments and consider in further detail. But it's a fairly, I would say, time-consuming process. The methodology has to be robust, and you really need to understand, I think one of the lessons learned from this process is not just the legal frameworks, but the local context much more, the local capacity much more. So that I think is an area that we have to focus on more clearly in this new policy. And I'm sure others will speak about this as well. So I'll finish there, but it would be very helpful to have your feedback also from what I've just mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Irina, would you like to come in?
Thank you. Thank you, Gelson, and thank you, Ibu Ria. I think Bruce really covered it very well, but I just wanted to mention that we definitely appreciate the importance of the local context, and in application of ADB requirements within the country, even within Indonesia, there will be a great variation across provinces, across geographical areas on implementation arrangements, which are meant to achieve the same purpose pretty much, or the outcome is the same, but the ways that we need to consider local context will be quite different. And I think it also relates to the question of the implementation gap. There are laws and regulations, plus there are local laws and regulations at provincial level, for example, but there is also a gap between what the law requires and what the implementation practices on the ground as well. So we try to factor in those variables, if you will, as well. I guess the flexibility that is provided by the sort of proposed new approach to CSS is to be more oriented towards the outcome and see how we can sort of achieve the outcomes using local approaches and local ways of doing things in achieving measurable outcomes that are relevant for resettlement, for example, or for achieving livelihood restoration, or for protection of indigenous people's rights in the areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Irina. Ibu Ria, do you have any follow-up, or was your question addressed?
Cukup, supaya yang lainnya juga bisa menyampaikan pertanyaan. Terima kasih banyak, Bu Irina, Pak Bruce, Bu Sehra, Pak Gelson. Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih, and do continue to write your comments in chat, please. Thanks. So our next batch of people who will be asked to raise questions will be Claire Forbes. Good to have you again, Claire. You have been to our previous consultation, most recently the FCA, so I assume your question is quite related to the Pacific situation as well. So do come in, please.
Thanks, Gelson. I'm not sure if my audio is very good today. So I had asked about a country level gap analysis, which had already been talked about as a more effective approach than a project by project approach. I guess in a situation, in a context like the Pacific, that would make more sense. But I'd also like to relate that to Zahara's presentation around gap filling actions and capacity needs, and I think there needs to be a distinction between the two elements there. They're not one and the same, they're very much two different things. So gap filling to meet the SBS, and capacity needs, that is like a longer term improvement. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I think I will be calling two panelists here to respond. In the first instance, Zara would provide response to the question on the how of gap filling action plus capacity building support, and maybe to provide some comparison on how it's actually being done in various regions. I will call on Mr. Ricky Barba on their experience in South Asia. Zara?
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, Claire. I think it wasn't very clear when I was when I was explaining it. But yes, the assessment. If we undertake an overview assessment, or we undertake an assessment at the level of the country programming stage, when the country is formulating their engagement plan with ADB and discussion, at that stage, areas can be identified, which would we can at that stage see where the gaps are in terms of capacity. So which areas need more, where can we have programs to build capacity of the governments and their different safeguards departments, or different, or within certain sectors that are high priority sectors for the government and ADB, what are those areas where capacity building measures can be developed? But the same assessment can also identify if the government is interested in pursuing CSS for certain projects, then what can be the gaps that can be filled at the level of that particular project. But we also strongly think that there's a need to look at the bigger picture and build capacity slowly and through different interventions, but if possible in some small pockets, like through results-based lending, address it at the level of that institution and try to, within a program, try to implement as well as build capacity. And that would be like sort of like on-the-job training, in a way that you sort of build capacity as you go along, and by improving the systems as well as increasing capacity. So there are two things that sort of go hand in hand, but the bigger picture, yes, is building capacity through trainings and through better strengthening those systems.
Thank Zara. Maybe just to provide some comparison on how it's done, the gap filling measures and capacity building support in the context of South Asia, where ADB did this CSS. One is in India, the other one in Sri Lanka. Ricky, can I please call you to come in? How you've done it?
Yes. Thank you, Gelson. And I hope I understand what just wants me to discuss. But just to say that I work in South Asia, and the country safeguard systems application has been very different in each of the countries, depending on the need and depending on the application of the methodology. For India, for example, we had an agency that already had very robust policies, very close to SPS. And basically, what was asked for was approval, basically to use their system in an ADB project, in the coming ADB projects, and that was for Power Grid. On the other hand, we had an agency also in Sri Lanka, which had less capacity than Power Grid, but actually it was quite outstanding based on Sri Lankan standards. And I think this also echoes what our colleague from Indonesia had been explaining, that you have to have certain flexibilities because there are different situations and different needs. But I was also looking at your comments in the chat box, and for Sri Lanka, for the Roads Development Authority, what we were really looking at is to augment good practice and long-term improvements because they already had a system. But for example, and I used this example yesterday as well, a big issue from environment was roadkill because of their significant large mammals, and this was the Roads Development Authority. So through the country's safeguard systems, we invested in helping them develop manuals, bringing good practices on dealing with this upfront, rather than when the project is already being implemented. So there's this methodology that requires acceptability and equivalence assessment to be undertaken, but there also is the capacity building side of looking at what specific issues are in a specific country or a specific agency, and having CSS augment the gaps. Thank you.
Claire, do you have any follow-up to the responses so far? And Ricky, I know that you've been trying to do this. If you could speak slowly, please. Thank you.
I apologize to the interpreters, especially.
Thank you for your feedback, Ricky and others. I guess my main concern is that the capacity building is only targeted to the implementing agencies, and sometimes at best executing agency, and that's actually not where the capacity constraints are. So I think we're talking about identifying the capacity constraints as a really important part of the methodology and helping that country where they would like to be helped, you know, lift the bar and improve where they need to improve, which does benefit ADB projects, but, you know, they should be the beneficiaries of that process, not ADB. Do you understand where I'm coming from? Thank you.
Yes, yes, Claire, I think I understand clearly. And in fact, the discussion in India has been a longer discussion because they had asked to look at the national system. And we had been looking at working with the Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change, for example. This work is still ongoing, but we do foresee that this would be the agency where capacity should be further strengthened and really looking at how their policies can be improved. So perfectly acknowledged, yes. And I do know that that's the direction that improving this methodology further is looking at. And that's why your questions are very important.
Thanks, Ricky. And I can also call on Bruce here because I remember yesterday there was a government representative from Southeast Asia region who said the importance of maintaining meaningful stakeholder engagement in the project, even if the CSS is being applied targetedly. So, Bruce, would you like to come in here?
Just very briefly, Gelson, so that we can, allow time to hear from others. I firstly wanted to say, thank you, Claire, and it's a really important point. And from my perspective, when we approach both the understanding of the legal framework as well as the capacity, and I do agree with you. Of course, they're linked issues, but you also need to assess them somewhat separately. I would advocate both a sort of a top-down and a bottom-up approach that cascades. You need to understand sort of the country context. You need to then be working with various different agencies and not necessarily only restricted to the project executing and implementing agencies, because, for example, they may not be responsible for certain issues. Maybe a land agency might be implementing involuntary resettlement separately. So you need to work across the system, basically, with all actors. And that obviously does take time. But coming from the bottom up at the project level, you can also contextualize more in terms of what are the issues and the risks and the outcomes that you need to achieve at that level. But working one without the other doesn't give you the complete picture. So I think that's something that we have to work towards, and definitely long term. Perhaps later in the consultation, we can come and talk a little bit more about capacity building approaches. I've got further thoughts, but it'd be good to hear from others as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
I'll certainly circle back to you when we have enough time. And I'm sure you have been frequently sending us additional comments in chat, so that's well noted and documented. For now, our next batch of people who will raise questions will be Dr. Goking Shi, and after him will be Yubel Putra. Dr. Shi?
Yes, okay. It's my pleasure to join this consultation meeting again. And first of all, I think this country safeguard system is a good approach, and especially to more efficiency and more benefit for the bank and also for the country and the DMC and also for the project itself. This is general. But for constraints, I think it's very important that we have to think about that. It's a country legal and institutional system. It's not easy to be changed. So it will be slowly, gradually changed to meet the requirement of the ADB, World Bank, and whatever international finance institutions. So it's a long journey. So this is, I think we recognize that this is, but it's good approach. And we can see many cases in China, actually before 1990, before 2000s, actually even the government have not recognized this social impacts, social risk is the most important of the decision-making factors, key elements, but now it's totally changed. So I'm engaged in the ADB-TA 3441 from 2000-2002 is the Chinese capacity building in social assessment. So I think it's a significant change in the view, concept, and also the instrument. And now it's the social assessment is a very important part of the feasibility study. And also very important, we have a social stable risk assessment as a national requirement for any big decision-making, significant decision-making, and investment projects. Each project have to do this social stable risk assessment before the decision-making. So I think this is a social components is most one of the most important factors to support the scientific and good decision making process. So I think in India, it's for land acquisition and inventory settlement. Actually, in the past, it's adopted is law in 1894, but 2013 it's changed. So it's a new resettlement law. And in Laos, you can see this new ACTA actually with ADB support. So we can see this is a good approach to change to improve the legal system and the institutional system. But it's a long journey. It's not can be achieved one day, or 1 month, or 1 year. So in this case, if the CSS adopted in the more countries, how we can do? I think maybe you can define the different sectors. Not only the whole country, but also can define some different sectors, like what sector, like the transportation sector, like the education sector. So maybe it can be some flexible for some sectors. You can apply this country system. So maybe not the whole country. Maybe you can divide the different sectors. So this is one approach. So this is, I think it can be done, because for my personal view, it's difficult to actually, most the country can achieve this standard, international standard in the developing countries. This is quite difficulties, but we have to do. We have to go. So what's another approach is that is capacity building, but the capacity building should be divided at different level. I think most important is the decision making level or administration level, especially the national authority. Like in China, is if we can, if involved is the MOF, Ministry of Finance, and also State Planning and Reform Commission. This is two very important comprehensive authority to manage the national fund, national investment. Also other ministries, linear ministries, Ministry of Water, Ministry of Land, Ministry of Ecological and the Environment, and so on. So this is some key ministry should be involved. I think this is a very important lesson learned from my personal experience during the 2000-2002. I collaborate with NDRC and the Ministry of Finance and the CIECC, Chinese International Consulting Company, because who are the independent review institution on behalf of the NDRC to manage investment feasibility study report, quality control. And so this is very important to engage this powerful authority to understand how to apply this kind of ADB policy. This is because can get the more open the door, can more efficiency activities to build the national and secretary, industry, the capacity, and also the from civil society. So this is very important. Second, I think is also some linear ministries, like a Ministry for Environment and Ecological and Environment, for EIA to environment management, environment and social assessment and management, and also Ministry of Land, Ministry of Natural Resource, regarding the inventory settlement, land acquisition, and also some other institutions who are responsible different, aspects, different elements of CSS. So I think this is also very important. Some TA can collaborate with some linear ministry. And also third one, I think is very important to cooperate with education system, especially the universities, to establish the long-term sustainable capacity. Like in CSS now, globally, we can see it's almost very few university who has the education program in land acquisition and resettlement. Hohai University, my university, is the first one in the world to establish this program for land acquisition, inventory settlement, reconstruction, rehabilitation since 1988 for BA, then 1993 for MA, 2004 for PhD. So this is very important. We can have some short-term training, but it's not the professional career. So this, we need the long-term sustainable home resource to support this CSS. So in this perspective, the ADB and World Bank can support the university to develop some program in BA, in MA, in PhD, and to develop this sustainable and high level good home resource for the future, for long term, for sustainable development. So in my university in 2013, we developed some PhD and master program in resettlement management and engineering, resettlement science and engineering, sociology. This is very important. So many developing, undeveloped countries send their students to here. This is a long-term capacity building. Now we can see our students go back to the country and build their national capacity. So I think this is an education program can be support the CSS to develop the national capacity long-term. I think this is also very important. The fourth, I think we can build the global and regional network or union for environment and social safeguards, because this is very important networking to help each other based on the support of the ADB and other international finance institutions like World Bank and AIAB and so on. This is very important to, through this home resource development, then support our future development. This is my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shi. That's quite comprehensive. So I'll try to quickly summarize the key points I heard from you, which I think can be in 3 points. One is the advantages of the application of the CSS. The second one is the reality check. The third one are your recommendations. You mentioned that the application of CSS provides a greater level of efficiency to achieve development project outcomes. That's one. However, you also mentioned that doing this approach, while good, can be quite difficult because it takes time. It's a long journey to get countries to change the country system. Moving forward, you made 4 concrete suggestions. One is define the sector in which the CSS will apply. Second is a long-term capacity building with a very targeted agencies, including the key agencies in the government, just as Ministry of Finance, Planning Agency, also the line ministries, also administrative authorities. At the same time, it's also important to consider including this in the graduate curriculum of universities. And the fourth one is building that network. I believe that ADB has been doing some parts of it, and I'd like Bruce first to give like an overview of how we've been responding to this suggestions and realities. And I know that in Zara's presentation, she mentioned also about the network, which is the regional community of practice. And where have we been there so far, and what's next there in terms of the network and the capacity building support. So Bruce and Zara, please.
Thank you, Delson. And thank you, Dr. Sheets. Nice to see you again. Thank you for joining. Firstly, to say I appreciate and very much agree with the points that you've made. It very much reflects, I think, our own understanding of the issues and also some of the constraints, and it helps reinforce our understanding of those issues. I think there's about 4 points that I'd like to just raise. Firstly, the long-term approach is very much necessary and recognized, and we need to develop, I think, long-term partnerships to do that with the country, between development partners such as the ADB and other multilateral and bilateral development agencies working together, but also with civil society and with universities, such as yourself. I think, only through that long-term approach and with partnerships can we really do this. We have to have a common understanding. Of course, even with that framework, it will take time. Countries have their own legal frameworks, and they have their own processes for changing those, and political processes and priorities within the country certainly have their own complexity and take time. I think that's also why we've not really been able to go forward comprehensively with this idea of use of country systems, because the MDBs, of course, we have our own policies which are aiming for sort of a uniform approach on what we might consider international good practice. But that also keeps changing. As we now in this policy update process, there are many evolving or new areas that we're discussing, including on the social issues that you raised. And so, I think that pushes the bar, and it's maybe an expectation that's challenging to say we're going to find, always equivalence. Of course, we want to work with governments if they're very keen to update and strengthen their systems. But, obviously the challenge is something that we have to recognize. Now, some approaches that ADB can take forward in this space, just to put out and reinforce some of the recommendations also that Zara was looking at. We do think that robust country diagnostics are going to be very important, and we have to update those regularly. We'd also propose that those diagnostics can be linked into ADB's discussions at the country partnership level. So we develop a country partnership strategy, we have dialogue with the government, we have dialogue with civil society. That diagnostic analysis should feed into that. And that would then allow us to have a discussion with the government. Are they interested in doing more work? Can we support that? Can we develop partnerships with others? Are there priority sectors? We should be a little bit more systematic on that approach. Secondly, on the collaboration with other partners, and you mentioned universities. This is something that we have been aspiring to do with a long-term capacity approach. For example, in several countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, a group of development partners have been collaborating to establish what we've called safeguard learning centers. And the idea behind these are centers of excellence that will be able to take forward capacity building, to customize that to local situations, to meet local demand for it. In the Philippines, for example, this is embedded in the University of the Philippines. And so it's a partnership with learning institutions. And then development partners like ADB, the World Bank, Australian Department of Foreign Affairs have then been providing resources to support that process. So I think that's an approach that we can use and build off. And, collaboration in each country. Who are the partners that we should collaborate with to then develop and support at different levels for decision makers, for agencies, etc. So these are some things that we're thinking about to try and strengthen. There would be lots more I can say, but I'll stop here and allow others to come in as well. But thank you again, Dr. Shi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shi. And please feel free to write your additional comments in chat, please. If there's time, we will also call you if you have additional questions. All right, moving on. We have Yubel Putra from Gaia to ask question. And after him, may I call also on Putri Handayani, who raised comments in chat box as well. So if we could do this in this second batch, we have Putri and Yubel, that will be good. After them, we will have colleagues from NGO Forum, Annabelle Pereras and Nadine, if I could call both of you in the next batch, please. Yubel, over to you.
Thank you, Gelson. I'm going to share experiences from the ground in regards to CSS around waste to energy incineration project. As explained before, we need to ensure that ADB strengthens country safeguard systems by meeting international legal instruments and standards and not sharing them to make project controversial for its environmental and social harm, to be easier to approve and be operational on the ground. Well, Gaia have been seeing project landing and technical assistance activities that have been approved, generating policy advice or facilitating a broad range of activities inimical to national safeguards or ongoing country tensions around environmental and social safeguarding. So some lessons learned regarding CSS from the Philippines and Maldives and India. In Maldives, ADB has a waste incineration project in Tulakbeshi. However, the national government has no regulation on waste to energy incinerator. They don't have regulation on how to manage and transport hazardous ash resulting from this incineration process, or how to control toxic pollutions from waste incinerator. There are also means to ban most single-use plastic by 2023, which is needed by waste incinerator to operate, to burn it. And the Maldives has also set a net zero target by 2030, one of the most ambitious targets for an island nation. Yet the science is clear that burning waste is not the way to achieve these ambitions. And in India, ADB supported and facilitated the formulation of the country's solid waste management manual through the toolkit of public-private partnership framework for municipal solid waste management. It puts waste to energy as part of the hierarchy or solid waste management options through providing technical advice and capacity building despite increasing court decisions around closure of waste to energy incinerator because of the environmental violations. And on the other side, the Philippines, it has a standing waste incinerator ban through its Clean Air Act, Ecological Solid Waste Management Act. Still, ADB provided capacity support to the Philippines with TA 8566 regional and also TA 9292 regional, both in Cebu City and Quezon City. Let me quote from one TA in Cebu, which mandates to conduct due diligence and early stage preparation of projects, including but not limited to technical studies, specification, and report dealing with technical, financial, economic, legal, and regulatory framework, which support waste incineration in the Philippines, which include marketing, tendering, managing roadshows, and so many others. And all these activities are supported by ADB to assist the WT industry to enter the Philippines despite of the standing ban on incineration. In regards to the acceptability assessment, the Philippines and Maldives do not have any track record implementing waste to energy incinerator projects. On the other hand, India has a bad track record in operating waste incinerator. The WTE facilities there have been found to spew toxic pollutants, such as dioxins, found from monitoring processes. In the Philippines, we are speaking now, our members of Gaia are meeting now and leading a multi-sectoral conference along the church, academe, environmental, and human rights ground in opposition to the WTE project supported by ADB in Cebu, in the presence of the mayor that this TA has supported. In the Maldives, there was a similar project by World Bank, which failed due to financial and technical constraints. However, ADB ignores this bad track record and chooses to continue with the WTE project. And India, the ADB-funded Okla WTE case was closed for its emission and known for its inability to report on the promised offsets. Similarly, this happens in Indonesia, where big-scale waste incinerators have failed miserably over the last decades and have received a strong push from local CSOs. There, ADB recommends WTE incinerators through technical assistance in 4 cities in Batam, Malang, Medan, and Kendari. Our examples show that any financing modality can dilute national safeguards and skirt around international law and standards. When the assistance is used to push project approvals and industry interests before the protection of people and environment. And these TAs have been approved without due diligence requirement. And these are very highly dependent on consultants' capacity and knowledge. Add on top of that is the fast, continuously evolving policy discourse that keep changing, especially around climate and health aspect, as discussed before. On the result-based lending, one example of problematic output would be reduced carbon emission from landfills. This is how it is phrased in the new energy policy. So this output is not a good one, and it's bad when you're comparing incinerator and landfill. It's like comparing the bad with the worst. And a consultation with stakeholder will help strike this output out. Therefore, when host country regulations differ from international recognized standard, the borrower will achieve whichever is more stringent as written in the current SPS and not apply less stringent standard. The most stringent standard should reflect mandates from international conventions such as Stockholm, Basel, Rotterdam, and Minamata conventions, even when the borrower has not ratified these conventions. Lastly, ADB should also consider the no project alternatives approach. When first, the project is against national standards, as I explained, and second, when it is found that the borrower does not have a good track record, capacity, and commitment to implement the safeguard requirements. I'll stop there, and thank you, Jensen.
Thank you, Bill. We recognize that you have done your project level research highlighting some of the project level issues there. Now, we want to elevate this conversation again of these projects to the CSS. So I will now call on Ricky Barba to address question of, when do we decide to apply CSS in projects such as this, or do we actually apply them? I think that's, we have to start there first. Ricky, why don't you take a first crack?
Yes, thank you, Gelson. And I think that is how I would have started answering the question with respect to basically Mr. Yobel's, sorry, is my video on? Okay, it is, I think. I was going to start from the very bottom part, but I do note that I think Bruce has switched on, has unmuted. And Bruce, do you want me to continue or would you like to start?
Oh, thanks, Ricky. I'll just quickly make one or two first points. Thank you, Yobel, firstly, for raising these issues. And the project level analysis and research that you've done is really useful. And if there's anything additional that you want to share with us, from a written statement or details, then we're very happy to look and have a look at that. Before Ricky maybe talks a little bit about some of the experience and some of the work in South Asia, I'll just talk about a couple of key points. Firstly, there are definitely regulatory differences and gaps across the countries that we work in, and particularly with respect to technologies. You've been talking about waste to energy and incineration technologies, and these may not be well covered. Of course, if there's a blanket prohibition or ban on a certain technology in a country, then that would need to be followed, because we need to make sure that we're not in contravention to national laws. So, that's something that has to be very carefully looked at, and including from a legal perspective and confirmed with the government at the country level. But the provisions that we have in the existing policy, and which I expect will be continued, in that where there are differences between a host country's regulations with international good practice standards, then we would seek to apply the more stringent standard. I think that is still a principle that we'd be looking to apply in the context of the new policy. Now, of course, where a host country has ratified international conventions, then also that needs to be followed, but we're also going to be looking more wider at key international conventions that would be relevant to bring into the policy framework. Of course, there are many international conventions, so we need to look at which are the key ones that come into a safeguards context. So I just wanted to mention those 2 points first, but then I'll pass back to Ricky. Thank you.
And I actually just wanted to stress those points, so I may not be able to add too much. But first of all, Yobel, I know where you're coming from. I'm Filipino, so we don't incinerate. And for that reason, I may not be an expert on incineration, although I work in South Asia. I cannot talk on the Philippine projects that you mentioned. But yes, I just want to underline that the discussion is on country safeguard systems. And I agree with exactly with what you explained towards the end of your statement, which is where there are there is insufficient legislation, or the country system is not sufficient, then we will not do country safeguard systems. I think that's very clear under the current existing policy, unless there is equivalence. One, and clearly those things that you have mentioned do not point to equivalence. I have not exactly looked at your exact points, but I can say based on what you said that it does not look like there will be equivalence nor acceptability, because as you said, so we look at equivalence. Does the country safeguard system cover it before we use it? And further, we use acceptability, which is track record. And again, on face value on what you said, it seems that there is no track record. That's your assertion. So where there is no track record, we would not apply country safeguard systems. We would stay with SPS, and also in addition to all the national legislations and international best practice as it's covered by SPS and the safeguards. So I do appreciate what you said. It's on the project level, because I look at South Asia. I'm familiar with the project, though I'm not the project officer. If you have an issue on my project on affordable housing, please let me know as soon as possible. But I will bring this to the team, because I think those are very useful moving forward. You've cited specific projects and specific issues, so let me bring that in if we can document it from this discussion. But again, turning back to CSS, yes, I think we have no disagreement. Where there's no equivalence and acceptability currently, CSS will not be applied. Power Grid was different. Power Grid had very clear own policies that they could also change, and that's the reason why we agreed for transmission lines. Not something like waste to energy, but transmission lines for Power Grid. They could follow their own system. And the project completion report is there so that we can learn from it. And that's the experience in South Asia. Thank you. Back to you, Chelson.
Thank you, Ricky, for highlighting the acceptability and the equivalence requirements. Yobel, is there anything that you would like to add from your research? And I hope that we can also have a copy of your ongoing project analysis, because I think they can also be useful in other topics of safeguards consultation.
Yeah, I think I want to highlight that the fact is, we agree that the country safeguard should not be applied in this project, but the fact that ADB pushing national policy changes through technical assistance to allow this project to continue despite of the opposition and the lack of standards is what concerns us as CSOs. So that's why I said on my last phrase, ADB should also consider no project alternatives, because these TAs will have a lot of difficulties, especially during this rapidly changing, policy discourse internationally, where you have these new conventions which has not been ratified, and also the capacity of local consultants, which I have found in many countries, they don't have the most up-to-date, information on this international legislation, standards, and conventions. So this might be a problem, and that's why when this situation happen, I'll likely to recommend for no project alternatives rather than pushing for a technical assistance, which happened now in the Philippines, in Cebu, in Quezon City, and in many other countries.
Thank you, Yobel. I think Bruce might want to come in on the project alternatives, please, before we move to the next question.
Yes, Yobel, thank you. That's really well taken. I think the alternatives analysis, including the no project alternative, I think the work around that in project development needs to be strengthened, needs to be linked into the feasibility studies, and then linking to discussions around stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultation. That is a stage in the process where you really do need to have meaningful consultation when you're considering the alternatives, not at a stage where project has basically already been decided, technology already selected, and then you're sort of consulting from there around, maybe mitigation measures. It certainly needs to be pushed in an earlier stage. So I think that's a point well taken. It's an area both on stakeholder engagement and alternatives assessment where we need to revisit a little bit some of the language in the policy, but then also practically, because it's that, as I said, engagement processes that need to be more practically developed. And I think we need to have beyond policy going into guidance and then capacity support to governments, executing agencies, project proponents to push that more. So thanks for highlighting that.
Thanks, Bruce. And then thanks also, Yobel. We have 5-10 minutes left. So I wanted us to move to the last 3 questions that get asked. So Annabelle and Nadine, if I could call you at the later part, please. I just want to make sure that we got Putri Handayani in the room. Let me try to read your questions instead. The advantage is that the ADB SPS helps to protect the vulnerable, affected people, which most of the time does not describe in detail in Indonesian law and regulations. The disadvantage, where the ADB SPS caused high costs for project owners, governments, they would refuse or ask for flexibility from SPS. Suggestion. Please create a list of regulation or policy in every country that has been approved or included in ADB CSS. So unless Ms. Putri could come back, maybe in the interest of time, can I call you again, Bruce, and maybe Zara also to address these very clear questions from Ms. Putri?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Putri. I'm sorry the internet wasn't working, so we couldn't hear you directly, but it's a very good comment that you had placed already. Feel free to add further in the chat box if there's additions. I'll go to the recommendation because I agree with you in terms of the issues. This is something that we'd like to try and work through more systematically with country diagnostics. We do think that every country that we work in, we need to have a diagnostic analysis looking at the country system, the laws and regulations and the relationships of those to our own policy. What are the areas of convergence? What are the areas of difference? And then that also allows us to then at a more project specific level to go into further details. So I think that is something that we've been doing some work on already. In fact, apart from the 3 countries that were mentioned in Zara's presentation, India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, where we've done more detailed work around equivalence and acceptability for considering the potential use of country safeguard systems. We have also done what we call rapid diagnostics for about 20 countries over a period of years, and these need to be more systematically developed and updated on a regular basis and then linked into the partnership discussions. So yes, certainly agree. You'd suggested a list of regulations that have been approved. You know, I think we would probably not go as far as to say, you know, ADB approves or disapproves of a particular regulation, but we would more couch it in terms of, you know, is there a gap against what ADB or international good practice might consider? So we'd sort of couch it more as a gap than approve or not approve. I'll stop there, but you might like to come back further in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. All right, so I think we have come to the last set of questions. So our forum colleagues, why don't we start with you, Annabelle, and after you, I will quickly call Nadine.
Okay. Thank you, Gelson, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to be quick and incorporate also the comment of Nadine, since she cannot speak right now. So the first off is a comment, and then the two next point are questions. So with the first comment, this has been raised by our members as well in terms of providing the safe space in the current consultation setting. And we recognize also that that has been also a point that has been consistently raised by ADB in conducting this consultation. So we would also like to inform the bank that there are several members of us who would like to participate, but then they are still questions in terms of ensuring their anonymity, and that this consultation will be safe for them to participate. And then moving forward, we would also like to, of course, this is not only about CSS, but more so this issue in terms of process-wise and on the consultation process would be very more critical once we move on when the W paper is released. So again, we would just like to raise it to the bank as well. Now, moving forward to the CSS, we have noted the benchmarking studies that the ADB had done. So you have cited World Bank, AIB, and IDB, if I recall it correctly. So in the case of World Bank, there has been that provision in terms of materially consistent. And then what we have been hearing so far is that currently in the SPS approach, there has been challenges in terms of doing the acceptability and equivalence assessment. But from the forum's perspective, yes, we do recognize these challenges, but at the same time, we would request the bank not to dilute these strong provisions that we consider in the current safeguard policy moving to the new safeguards policy. Because we have also noted that you are thinking in terms of adopting these new approaches. So we hope that there can be that balance in terms of still retaining these two methods in terms of strengthening and then eventually using CSS. So that call in terms of will the harmonization with other MBBs pose risk in terms of dilution of the current language in the CSS going into the new safeguards policy? And then the third point is, again, recognizing the strong languages that we have on the current safeguard policy when it comes to the use of the accountability mechanism. I don't know if that has been discussed already, but we'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of what is the SDCC thoughts in terms of using, or in terms of what are the implications of the use of the accountability mechanism in a CSS applied project when we're now talking to the new safeguards policy. And lastly, we also have several materials as well. CSS regional overview to mitigate transboundary infrastructure mega project impacts in Mongolia, Indonesia, and Myanmar. So I don't know if you have already received it before, but we will also send it to the bank for further reference as well. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. I think the first 1 and 2 questions will go to Bruce because it pertains to ensuring safe, open, and inclusive consultations moving forward with the consultation process, especially when the W paper is about ready for public discussion. The second is the question from position reiterated by Annabelle, about ensuring that the use of the CSS would not lead to the dilution of the strong provisions that are already in the current SPS, the requirement for equivalence and acceptability, despite the fact that you've been trying to compare or trying to harmonize this with peer MFI standards. I think the third question goes to Zara about, will the use of country safeguard system still be covered by the accountability mechanism? So yeah, over to you, Bruce, and then Zara.
Thank you, Gelson, and thank you very much, Annabelle and other colleagues from the NGO Forum. Great points. On the first one around safe space for the consultations, firstly to say, we hear you. This is an issue that we're concerned about. From the outset, we wanted to make sure that this process is open and transparent and safe for everyone. We have been making some additional provisions in these consultations to allow people to opt out or to come back to us if they're concerned about anything that may have been said, which they feel uncomfortable to have on the record. And we're certainly committed, if there's concerns, we can redact. We're also, as you've seen in this consultation and others, we're trying to set up systems where people can make confidential comments so that we can protect identities and create a space. Because, I accept that there may still be concerns, and we'd be very happy to hear about those. We have received some communications by email, which we've been looking at. And if there's other further recommendations that you would like to make to us in terms of how we can improve this, we're very much open to hearing that. A couple of other quick points that I'll mention. We are planning the next phase now of country level consultations, where we will be doing consultations in about 10 countries with our developing member countries, but also with civil society. And, we've heard about the need to make sure that those sessions are very safe. I think we'll put in place some additional protocols like not recording sessions. Maybe we need to look carefully at who's involved, vetting participation to make sure that there's no threats of intimidation or potential for retaliation. So again, open to hearing recommendations for those sessions. And then thirdly, as a more forward-looking agenda, we've actually proposed inside ADB collaboration with our team, but with our NGO and Civil Society Centre, to work on, there's a new technical assistance on civil society participation. And we'd like to include in that the development of some guidance materials on organising, safe consultation processes. So that's a piece also where we very much appreciate engaging with you. So that's, I think, on your first one. Just very quickly on the other points before Zara comes in, I just mentioned we are looking at terminology, equivalence, acceptability, material consistency, functional equivalence, these terms. But I think coming below that, the main tenets of, assessing the government's regulatory frameworks, laws, regulatory frameworks, the main baseline of their country systems, still needs to be undertaken. And I think the consideration of equivalence and acceptability still needs to be part of that. But one thing we are thinking of, just thinking at this stage, because we still have to do more consultations, is a bit more of a focus at the project level. Now, what do I mean by that? Right now, the proposal inside the safeguard policy statement is that you do these broad level country assessments with a view to accrediting at that level. But it's really before you are understanding what are the particular project level issues and risks that you might be dealing with. And we want to strengthen that linkage, because you have to be able to say that the outcome of the application of the CSS for this particular context would be consistent. And that's really where it matters. And that's where, track record and capacity and contextual risks all needs to come into that analysis as well. So that's where we're thinking of making some levels of change, still for consideration though. And then on the accountability mechanism, it must apply. That there's no opting out of that. So just to preempt. But Sarah, would you like to come in and add anything on the points I just mentioned?
No, actually, I think that's you addressed it very well. That is what I would say as well. focusing on outcomes. And just a little bit there is that with this performance standards approach, where we have individual standards addressing different areas, that outcome assessment is will be more comprehensive. So it'll be contrary to that. It will not be diluted in any way, because what we anticipate and we hope for is that through more detailed and clearer provisions in or through this standards approach, it'll give us a better chance to address the safeguards outcomes. So which will then also apply if we are looking at CSS. So I think I don't think I can add more to that. It's pretty clear.
But with regards to the accountability mechanism application, Zara, not sure if it's been addressed.
ADB's accountability mechanism still applies to safeguards frameworks. So that role would not change, but we haven't looked at them in in this context yet.
I can just add though, Gelson, under the current policy, the SPS, even in the case that you accredited a country or an agency to use CSS, the accountability mechanism applies in full, and we would not change that with a new policy. It's very important that the linkage with accountability is still maintained even in the use of CSS. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce and Zara. Annabelle, I'd like to go back to you if you have any follow-up comments, question.
No, thank you. And that's a good assurance to hear in terms of the applicability still of the accountability mechanism. So thank you, Bruce and Zara.
And we're also expecting forum's additional submissions in due time.
Yes, will do. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Annabelle. So on that note, I believe that we have gone over time, which is a reflection that we have a very substantive exchange, insightful comments during this Q&A. So thank you for your feedback. I'll now turn you over to Azim to do the poll, and I kindly ask that you still join us, please. Azim?
Thanks, Gelson, for framing and contextualizing our way forward on the discussions and for moderating the Q&A session. Mr. Bruce Dunn, Ms. Zara Abbas, Irina Novikova, yourself, Gelson, as well as Ricky Barba and Patty Moore, as well as the others working behind the scenes, including the EMT team. But of course, a big and special thanks to all of you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, and the sharing of your experiences, as well as the constructive feedback. I want to reiterate that the comments on the country safeguard systems that are received from this consultation and hereafter will of course be considered in the final study report. And this will subsequently inform the revision of ADB standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But as Gelson said, please don't go yet. We have a brief poll, as you can see on your screens now. We want you to rate the overall satisfaction with this particular consultation on a scale of 1 to 5. So give us a rank, 5 being the highest, 1 being the lowest, or of course, anywhere in between. This would really, really help us to better understand how effective these consultations and interactions have been. And we'd like to get your responses to that in the next, let's say, 45 seconds. In addition to this Zoom poll, we have the mentee poll on the Mentimeter. You can see that link also posted in the chat box now, and that link will remain open for a few hours after this consultation. Please specifically provide your input on how these engagements can be improved, and what we really want to do is encourage a dialogue back and forth between stakeholders in government, in civil society, and more broadly between you in the countries and the ADB more specifically. So if you have specific ideas on how that can be improved, please share those with us. There's always an openness and a willingness to accept and understand ideas. And as well as Mr. Bruce Dunn mentioned, if you have ideas on how to ensure that these consultations are a safe place to consult and how that can be improved, feel free to share those as well. But for now, let's return to the Zoom poll. And if we have the responses from that Zoom poll on a scale of 1 to 5, we have, let's say, almost 70% have said either highly satisfied or somewhat satisfied. 6% are dissatisfied, and a quarter are neutral. That's very helpful in that it provides us an opportunity to say that there's room for improvement, and we want to know what specific improvements or enhancements can be made to this process. This is an open dialogue, and in that spirit of openness, please feel free to share your comments and how the transparency and communication between stakeholders like yourselves and the ADB can occur on the mentee poll. Thank you once again for your overall feedback and participation. And I'd now like to bring you back to the Director of SDCC and this process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we've heard and to walk us through the next steps after this particular consultation. Bruce, could you please offer a review of the discussions and our next steps?
Thank you very much, Azim, and thank you so much for everyone joining today. We appreciate your feedback, and I can see from the poll today, we've not been able to satisfactorily provide, feedback in a forum that everyone has appreciated. And if you do have further comments and recommendations, we're always very open to hear those. In terms of the summary for today, let me highlight a brief set of points. Firstly, we do understand, and we've heard from many of the participants today, that there are advantages and disadvantages of the current approach. Of course, each country has its own legal frameworks. Those are developed in the local context, and they're also very slow to change. So that's something that we need to understand and accept. From the ADB policy perspective, I think we've been clear that we cannot use the country safeguard systems or rely on the country safeguard systems on their own unless they're considered to be equivalent or acceptable. And of course, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around the diagnostics of that. And even in the case that you've done country level assessments, the use of country systems also needs to be adapted very carefully to the local situation. This includes understanding of any contextual risks or social issues. For example, we heard about diversity of various different ethnic groups and indigenous peoples. That context needs to be understood very carefully. We also need to understand the potential implementation gaps. So the differences between what a law requires and what the actual implementation practice is on the ground. And I think one of the things that we highlighted there is that we need a greater focus on the likely outcomes that would be achieved from applying country systems and also from the capacity. Capacity needs assessments clearly need to be part of this work. It's linked to the understanding of the national legal and regulatory frameworks, but also somewhat separate. You need to have separate needs assessments and understanding the track record. Then we talked about strengthening capacity, and clearly that was recognized as a long-term issue. Also one where you need to have a focus at multiple levels, from the national level involving key agencies and decision makers, not just project implementing and executing agencies, but a range of different actors. Also, to embed long-term capacity, you need to work systematically with various different organizations at the local level, for example, collaboration with universities, civil societies, or other partners. We mentioned the work that we've been doing around safeguard learning centers or centers of excellence, and that's something that can be continued. And we'd like to continue that with greater partnership, but of course, that will need, again, a long-term approach and resources to move that forward. There are another range of other points that were raised, for example, around challenges with gaps in international laws related to specific technologies, the need to not just move forward in the where those gaps exist, but also to apply international good practice standards to address those issues. And then there was points made about the use of alternatives assessment, that needs to be strengthened along with stakeholder engagement for those processes. So, quite a range of issues that we need to focus on moving forward. I've really appreciated hearing your perspectives today. This is, to be honest, a challenging area, because we need to work with governments with their systems, but we need to take a long-term approach which manages the risks and seeks to strengthen their systems in the long term. So, I think that is where we really need to focus that long-term agenda. So I appreciated everyone joining. Thank you again. We'll look forward to connecting with you again in future consultations. We do still have other sessions planned, both on this topic, on country safeguard systems. We have 2 other sessions still this week. And then we've got other consultations coming up in the future around climate change, around gender issues, including gender and safeguards broadly, but also sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, and also sexual orientation and gender identity. And then there will be sessions planned around different financing modalities in the private sector. These will roll out still over the next couple of months. And that is then before we go into further country consultations, plus consultations with project affected people, and then the drafting of the policy. So still quite a lot for us to do. Team's very busy, and we really appreciate your sustained engagement in this process. So thanks again. Until the next time we meet, take care. Thank you.